Alrighty, so I want to get us going here because we're a minute past the hour and we've got a lot to cover today. But thank you, everyone who's joining and folks that are continuing to hop on. My name is Tessa Barron. I am with SVP and I'm our Disaster Preparedness Program Associate. And today we're going to be talking about a bunch of different topics on how to create communication strategies to reach older adults in disaster settings. Before we go ahead and jump into things, I first want to welcome everyone on behalf of AARP Tennessee. I don't believe that Mia McNeil is able to join us today. So just want to give a little bit of an introduction there. Then we'll cover a couple housekeeping items, and then we'll go ahead and get into the content. But I want to first start out by thanking Mia and her team at AARP Tennessee. We are working together this year as part of the Livable Communities program, and SVP is serving as a disaster resilience advisor. And so this is our second year working with the Livable Communities program, but first year working with Tennessee. And we really enjoyed working with Mia and her team this year. And we're excited that we're finally here about to kick off part one of our two-part series. And so for those that are on the call, you see that this is webinar one, identifying older adult communication needs in disasters. This is, again, part one of our two-part webinar series. And the series as a whole is all geared around building communication strategies for older adults. And so first session is today. We hope to keep things really engaging. You'll see that this is a meeting format as opposed to a webinar. And so we wanted to do that so we could, again, have a really engaging session. We will be having breakout rooms toward the second half, but until then, just ask that folks would please keep themselves muted just so we don't have any disruptions as we go throughout. That would be wonderful. This session is also recorded, and so hopefully folks are able to stay until the breakout session at the second half of the presentation today. But in the event that you do have to jump early, we'll have this video collateral that we can send out afterwards. And other than that, if folks could continue to put your name, your organization in the chat, you're welcome to put questions in the chat as well. But we will also have time for a Q&A session for you to speak out your questions to us, and we'll be able to communicate. You do have the ability to turn your mic on and off, so you can put questions again in the chat or save for the Q&A session. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started, and I'll start with a little bit of background information on who we are at SBP and our main mission for anyone on the call who might not be familiar with who we are. We are a social impact organization in the disaster space. And so we got our start just about 2 decades ago after Hurricane Katrina. And in those early days, our organization focused on rebuilding, on getting folks back home, getting people back into safe, sanitary, and secure housing. That still is a portion of the work that we do today. But in the almost 2 decades, our organization realized that if we really want to reach our main mission, shrinking the time between disaster and recovery and getting folks back home quickly, then we have to be proactive and we have to get ahead of the storm. And so you could see on the slide here that we have 5 of our many program areas at SBP highlighted below. And so build/rebuild is certainly still one of our focus areas, but we've actually expanded the scope of our operations and what we do to touch the full disaster cycle or the full spectrum. And so you can see that right smack in the middle is our preparedness program, and we'll be talking a lot about preparedness today. But again, we've really tried to expand what we do to touch the full disaster cycle so we can be proactive and again, get ahead of the storm. So that's a little bit about SBP. I want to share just a couple slides on the Prepare program specifically, just so you can get a sense of what our main goals are and what we aim to do in Prepare. We understand that we're in this period of time that's characterized by these storm events that are very frequent, very intense, and they're unfortunately not going anywhere. While we can't do anything to slow down these storms, we absolutely can do everything in our power to get ourselves prepared and to better equip those that we serve with knowledge, tools, resources, and information to get prepared, to make more informed decisions. And ultimately, what we're trying to do here is build towards communities that are disaster resilient. And when faced with disasters, they can thrive. And so we do a lot of preparedness, a lot of education in our preparedness program, because again, we want to equip folks with tools that they need to learn more about disasters, learn about their risks, learn how to make plans to ultimately stay safe. We also, if you could look in the chat, if you're interested in learning more, the link to our program page is on there. So if you want to learn more about what we do and prepare, more than welcome to check that out. We welcome folks to click that link. Next slide, please. So specifically who we serve and prepare, we have a couple different audience sets. We understand that disaster preparedness starts at the individual household level. And so you can see households are our first audience set. This includes both homeowners and renters. So we do a lot of household facing preparedness curriculum, trainings. We have a lot of resources on our website. But we also recognize that community leaders, businesses play a really crucial role in preparing individuals. So, like our call today and like this full session is geared toward practitioners, community leaders. We understand that it's really critical to equip those trusted community leaders, those voices that individuals listen to, with knowledge and information to get prepared. And so we do a lot of work with different communities all over the United States to get them prepared and they have them really be a hub of information that they can then disseminate that to individuals within the community. So community leaders, huge audience set for us. And then of course, businesses as well. We do work with business continuity because that is a piece of the preparedness puzzle as well. So certainly something we tackle. We also, on that website link, we have a bunch of resources if you want to check that out that are geared towards different types of audiences. So welcome you to check that out. And on the resource front, we will be sharing this out as well, but AARP does have a fantastic disaster resilience toolkit. Definitely want to encourage folks to check that out. There's a lot of great information, case studies, examples, and a lot of, again, information for you to learn from. So that's a resource that we definitely want folks to keep in their back pocket and take away from this session to have in hand. Next slide, please. And that's also in the chat as well. So here we have laid out our objectives of what we're going to cover today. And we're going to start out with disaster risks, understanding how those risks are evolving, how they're changing, how they're increasing, but with a particular lens at older adult risks. We're then going to shift gears a little bit and talk about how we can identify high risk older adult populations in the communities that you serve. And then lastly, we'll wrap up today with the content piece of a review of some best practices for strengthening communication and coordination between partners that serve older adult populations in disaster times. Next slide, please. So starting here with understanding disaster risks. Next slide, please. So understanding that our risks are changing, that really is the first step towards being prepared. It's important to understand that not only are our risks, disaster risks changing, they're becoming more frequent, and areas that maybe didn't experience disaster events in the past now may be experiencing a higher level of risk. And so we have some statistics here that I really want to share out because they emphasize the importance of understanding our changing risks. We saw in 2022, there were 18 separate disaster events, and each of those events cost at least $1 billion in damage. That stat in and of itself is very profound. Disasters are costly and certainly something that deserves our time and attention for planning. But especially when we compare that to 2023, we see a jump in 18 to 28 separate disaster events, each of which cost at least $1 billion in damage. So just in the span of 1 year, we saw an increase of 10 disasters that were very extreme, very pervasive, and very costly. Those statistics are for the United States at a national level. But what I want to share out here, since I know we have a lot of folks tuning in from Tennessee, is that if we look at the time frame of 1980 to 2024, there have been 114 confirmed separate disaster events, each of which had losses that exceeded $1 billion. So that's 114, and those are just confirmed. And so that's a very, very significant number of disasters that have impacted the state. But what's more important to note there, or what's also important, is that these disasters spanned across a wide variety of different types. We saw 15 drought events, 4 flood events, 3 freeze, 15 winter storms, 8 tropical cyclones, and 68 severe storms. So this really just speaks to the importance of getting prepared and doing what we can to prepare our families, but also in our roles as community leaders to do all that we can to better prepare the most vulnerable communities, which in this case, we're talking about older adult populations. Next slide, please. So we could see that this increase in disaster events really poses a threat to the safety and the well-being of really everyone, but especially older adult populations are a very vulnerable subset of the population when it comes to high levels of risks. And so what can we do? Our first recommendation at SBP is to use risk identification tools, and some of the tools that we're going to share out here are in the chat. So you're more than welcome to click on that and kind of browse through it as I talk through it. But to use these tools to understand risks and vulnerabilities and what areas within the, or what communities, what counties within the areas that you serve have a high level of risk. And so the first tool that I'll share here is FEMA's National Risk Index. And this is a tool that we actually share out both in household and practitioner audiences because it's very user friendly. So you're welcome to kind of keep this one in your back pocket. And if you're talking to older adult individuals, communities, and they're looking for a tool to get themselves started, definitely recommend this one as one to share out. But this is a really great one because it takes a look at 18 different types of natural hazard events, and it shows us information at the county level across the United States. And so what you can do is look up whatever, county you're interested in getting this specific information, and you can get a baseline risk measurement. So it's a really comprehensive tool. Again, looks at 18 separate natural hazard events. So it gives a nice strong picture of what types of risk a certain area could be dealing with. The other tool that I want to share out, and this is in the chat as well, is the Social Vulnerability Index. And this was developed by the University of South Carolina. And this is a tool that looks at 29 separate socioeconomic variables. And that really helps paint the picture of variation in social vulnerability throughout the United States. So using this tool, it can really help you pinpoint what communities, what counties have an uneven capacity for disaster preparedness, disaster response, disaster recovery, and resilience. So these two tools together are a really great starting point for starting to understand where again are the specific areas in my community that have high levels of risk, that have high levels of vulnerability, that I can then start there with disaster planning efforts to make sure that those areas are getting the resources and the support they need so they can stay safe in the face of future disaster events. Next slide, please. So we've been talking about, of course, this session is geared around older adult preparedness and what we can do to make sure that the older adult populations that we served, that their needs are met in disaster times. And so it's important for us to understand that older adults are a more vulnerable population, but we wanted to spend a few slides here to talk about exactly why older adults experience this high level of disaster risks, why exactly they're, a quite vulnerable population. And so I wanted to share out a couple contributing factors here. So first, we see in older adult populations that they have limited mobility, limited sight, hearing, cognitive ability. And what we're talking about here is a disability. And so in Tennessee specifically, 37.9% of older adults have at least one disability. And this is a statistic from 2019, so a little bit outdated, but it does show us that there's a significant portion of the older adult population in Tennessee specifically that experience or that does have a disability. And so that certainly is something that does put these individuals at a higher level of risk. So just important for us to know as community leaders that this is, something that our community deals with, and we need to allocate resources, time, and effort to make sure that their specific needs are met in disaster planning. We also see things like health issues with older adult populations. And the disruption of healthcare services really can be quite detrimental to older adult populations in disaster times. Limited social networks. Maybe we're talking about older adults that live in a nursing home, or maybe they're just not well connected. They don't have strong social connectedness and strong social networks that they're a part of. That certainly is a contributing factor. Other important ones to highlight here are dependence on caregivers and aid, and heavy reliance on battery powered medical devices. This is definitely one I want to emphasize here. And a statistic to highlight is that over 3 million individuals that have Medicare rely on battery powered medical devices. That's a large amount of individuals that, should they lose power, they're going to be in bad shape because they rely on these medical devices that are, again, battery powered to live independently. And so this is definitely, something that's significant for us when we're talking about what are the top actions we want individuals to take to get prepared. We need individuals to be thinking about things like this because power outages can happen at any time throughout the year with any type of disaster event. And so this is really a health concern that we need to keep top of mind. Other things here, and we'll talk more about this later in the session today and in the session next week or in a few weeks' time, is older adults generally have limited social media usage. And so when we're thinking about what are the best communication channels that we want to utilize to share out information on disaster risks with older adults, well, we really need to understand our audience and what methods that they use. And so maybe there are other things we want to consider aside from, social media and things along those lines. We'll talk through specifics in a little bit, though. Next slide, please. So, in continuing to understand why older adults have these high levels of vulnerability, we wanted to layer in some mental health considerations. And so, what the academic literature shows us is that about 80% of older adults have at least one chronic condition when compared to younger individuals. This is an important, important piece of information for us to have because these chronic conditions, coupled with other things like maybe stressors from a past traumatic event. So maybe this older adult that were, had dealt with a disaster event in the past, coupled with something like limited social networks, coupled with difficulty reestablishing after a disaster, whatever that might be, that leads to a significant likelihood that an older adult can develop mental health impacts from a disaster. So, definitely something that we need to keep top of mind. Additionally, older adults are approximately 2 times more likely to experience PTSD symptoms when compared to younger adults. So, these are all really important statistics that drive home the important message of older adults are a more vulnerable population. And so, therefore, having these conversations like we're having today of how can we specifically tailor our planning to make sure older adults' needs are met, so important. And so, lastly, here, not only do we want to understand why older adults are more vulnerable, what are those contributing factors? Another key piece is to really develop a strong understanding of at what point in the disaster cycle are these older adults most vulnerable. And so, for older adults specifically, we're talking about evacuation and recovery. And this really does make sense. If we're talking about a population, there's some mobility challenges, for example, well, then evacuation, again, mobility challenges, evacuation could we could be seeing some life-threatening barriers that need to be overcome in order to get out of harm's way safely. And so just one thing to keep in mind, but again, a lot of important considerations with when we're planning for older adult disaster preparedness, we want to have these things top of mind. Next slide, please. And the last thing that I'll share out here, that again is an important consideration, is older adults that have disabilities. And so, individuals with disabilities, and we talked about this a little bit before, but they are a group that's especially vulnerable to disasters. And why that's the case is, well, we need to consider things like existing barriers. So, things like housing, employment, financial stability, transportation, even. All of these are contributing factors that significantly can increase the risk of mental health issues both pre and post disaster. What's also good to note here and for us to know is that these barriers hinder the ability of individuals with disabilities. So, of course, we're talking about the subset of older adults with disabilities. It hinders their ability to adequately prepare and evacuate and recover. And so we touched on that a little bit in the last slide. but certainly important here as well. We see, and studies show us, that post-disaster, the fatality rate for individuals with disabilities, and this is especially those that are diagnosed with a physical, a sensory, or a physiological impairment, it's 2 to 4 times higher than the general population. This is a very extreme statistic that drives home the importance of why we need to be tailoring our planning to make sure that specific needs are met for our older adult populations in the areas we serve. And lastly, wrapping up here, we see that disasters increase the likelihood of individuals with disabilities to have medical emergencies. Maybe if their house is severely impacted, we see an increased likelihood of having to deal with transitional housing or some other sort of housing modification, which certainly poses as a stressor for individuals. And also we see an increased likelihood of the need for mental health services and counseling. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Tessa. And hi, all. Thank you again for joining us today. I'm Helen Wiley, our Disaster Preparedness Program Director at SBP. And building off of everything that Tessa shared with us, I'm going to briefly move us from talking a little bit about, understanding those risks in increasing disaster events to identifying older adult populations. So for those that work less day to day with older adults. And so next slide, please. And so, it's fairly intuitive, but what's really important is if you're trying to identify who could be those high risk older adults in your community, start by getting in touch with organizations in your area that are already well connected with older adults. And so that could be, you can work through your state or local health departments or local emergency management department, local agencies that have disaster planning and community mapping responsibilities, because they will usually already worked to map out different demographics, including those that are 60 or 65 plus, faith-based organizations that might have a larger constituent of older adults that they work with, and that trust-based relationships already built, as well as community organizations, or in some cases, businesses in the area that are well connected and that people attend. And so from there, one thing that's really critical is that so many communities across the US today have disaster registries. And if these are available in your community, it's a great tool to, again, get in touch with the local emergency management department, or whoever's hosting that, to, be able to know more about the individuals who could need extra assistance before, during, or after a disaster event. And so, there's different types of what disaster registries can look like. Some include more of access and functional needs as a registry. Others can include medical needs. Others have transportation needs. And so it's important to know, what are the registry types that are available in your area, and connect with those that run it to see what information your organization can get pre-event, or connect in with them so that, again, you're better networked, so that you know how to communicate appropriately or support if and when registries are utilized. Another thing to mention here is that you should look to see if your community has a COIN, a community outreach information network, or something similar. COINs are grassroots networks of people and trusted community leaders who can assist with emergency planning and the delivery of information to at-risk groups before, during, and after disasters. And so this would include many older adults in a community. COINs are actually composed often of trusted community leaders who can be helpful then in identifying and assisting those at-risk populations. And as you see here on this slide, we have a few resources listed that we'll drop in the chat, but that can be helpful if you want to learn more about building a disaster registry, or about COIN networks that might be in your area. Both of them are CDC resources. Next slide, please. And so another tool I wanted to mention, I know we've shared a lot of tools today, but what's really important again is when we're both trying to understand increased risks, what areas might have some of the highest risks, and then identifying older adult populations within those. There's a few different types of tools that are out there. This is just yet another example, but the National Council on Aging has a really great tool that they created a few years ago that visualizes um, some of the key characteristics for low income older adults. So those that are 60 plus and with incomes below 150% of the federal poverty level in their area. And so what this tool does is that it looks at statistics across internet and smartphone access, English and other language access, and then race and ethnicity. And so, you could look for your particular area of the state of Tennessee, or if you're based somewhere else, again, look for your region and get some important information to better understand. For instance, is, what percentage of older adults in your area have smartphone or high-speed internet access, where there's lower access to those types of resources, and start to utilize some of that information. For instance, if you are an organization that works across multiple regions, to make some determinations on higher priority areas where you might want to be deploying communication campaigns ahead of a disaster, during, or after, and what methods make the most sense if, for instance, there's lower smartphone usage. Next slide, please. And then again, some of you I'm sure are very well aware of area agencies on aging, but for those that don't work with older adults as much, just wanted to highlight that when we talked about the different local groups and assets that can be really helpful in identifying older adult populations, area agencies on aging are really key to that. They're, primarily responsible for any given geographic area, and they can also be multi-district. So if it's a rural area, it might be that they cover several different counties, but they coordinate and offer services that help older adults remain in their homes. And so as you can imagine, that would be incredibly important during a disaster event. And so something, for instance, like the Elder Care Locator website, which is listed here on the screen and we'll share in the chat, is really great because you can search in that tool and find any agencies in a given area that work with older adults. And so, for instance, I put in Knoxville, Tennessee, and there were over a dozen different agencies came up, and it categorized them according to what level of support that they offer. And so, if you don't work as often with older adults, or even if you do, using that tool to find out what other agencies in your area are responsible for different functional needs of older adults can be a really great resource and thing to start thinking about ahead of disaster events, of how to increase communication across your different organizations and reach out to those other entities to learn more about what tools and resources they have available as they also pertain to disaster events. Next slide, please. And then last here, I wanted to just highlight again the disaster registry aspect of things. There's really a real issue that there's a lack of understanding of where older adults or disabled persons are often located within a community. And so emergency response can be more limited to those that are just in assisted living facilities. And so that's where registries are really so critical, because getting people signed up who are highly vulnerable ahead of a disaster event really helps emergency responders know those that have the highest need if and when something occurs. And so really critical and something for many groups and agencies to be thinking about as a blue skies, non-disaster period activity to get more older adults that are highly vulnerable or that are disabled signed up for these registries that are available. And I'm going to harken back again to the AARP Disaster Resilience Toolkit, which highlights a few different case studies of how impactful these types of registries have been across the US. And so as you can see here, one example, for instance, was in Southern Oregon back in the 90s. they developed a disaster registry. And so then when there were devastating wildfires in 2020, people could really utilize that registry. So people got calls immediately after if they were on there offering support and assistance. And so really sped up the delivery of services for those that were vulnerable. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Tessa.
Thanks, Helen. So we're wrapping up here with different things to understand when it comes to how to best strengthen communication and coordination between partner organizations. Next slide, please. What we recommend at SCP for a starting point to kind of get a really nice inventory of all the stakeholders in your community, and again, to kind of get a lay of the land if you're just starting out, is to use FEMA's community lifelines. And we're just going to give a high level overview of what this tool is, and the link is in the chat. But this is a really nice resource that folks can rely on that's going to give a nice picture of all the fundamental community services that enable a community to function. So we're looking at things like safety and security, food, water, shelter, health, and medical services. Again, these are the backbone of a community. And if you're kind of at the first starting point of beginning to identify partner organizations that you'd like to build relationships with, this is a great starting point. Next slide, please. From there, you now have an understanding of the key players in your community, and we can now begin to hone in on which organizations you'd like to start building relationships with in blue skies times. It's so important to develop these relationships with trusted community partners, because that's how we're going to make sure that we can make sure that disaster messaging reaches older adults in a way that's going to work for them. And so partners to consider that you may or may not be aware of are public health officials. There's certainly a lot of overlap with public safety, safety of older adults, and ensuring that they are properly prepared. Community stakeholders, faith-based organizations, perhaps there's a strong faith presence in your organization, so that's certainly a hub to tap into. School officials and a variety of whatever community and neighborhood leaders are present in your community and are trusted voices, again, in your community. Next slide, please. From there, and this is a slide that perhaps a lot of you on the call are well aware of, and maybe you're past this point, but for those of you that are just starting out, maybe you have an idea of the organizations that you want to conduct outreach towards, and those partners that you want to build relationships with, but you don't exactly know how to go about doing it. And so we just have a couple helpful first steps outlined. And the first is to conduct that outreach, and what that means, either email or phone call outreach, of sharing your organization's main mission and what you aim to achieve. Share information about the populations that you serve, any preparedness initiatives or other types of disaster initiatives that your organization leads. And in sharing that, maybe you can start to identify some partnership opportunities. Also, the importance of, if you have identified certain partner orgs and they have any public facing events or meetings, whatever that might be, attending that, showing up, and showing them that you care and you want to learn more. And it goes both ways. If your organization has any public facing events, whether they're update meetings, whatever that might be, making sure that that invitation gets extended to the organizations that you hope to build partnerships with, so you can start to build that relationship by, again, attending each other's events. And whenever you do have the opportunity to interact with potential partners, make sure that you're advocating for the needs of your clients, and that what you aim to achieve is present in all of your conversations, and so that's well known. Next slide, please. And so we're wrapping up here because we want to go ahead and get into the breakout session, but wanted to just provide some best practices and what this can look like once you have identified your partner organizations. Once those relationships have been formed, how can we maintain those relationships and continue to develop them over time? And the first is provide information, strong lines of communication back and forth, whether there are different channels to consider, but whether that's a newsletter, an email list serve, website updates, recurring meetings, so having that in-person face-to-face time, social media updates, and things of that nature, all really great routes to consider. Step two here, completely centered around information gathering from partner orgs, different forums that you might want to consider are roundtables. Again, recurring meetings can have multiple purposes, and pulling together focus groups, maybe on a quarterly basis throughout the year. Then, want to make sure that we're involving partner organizations in the development of our disaster plans, from initial brainstorming sessions all the way to facilitating the plan and continued monitoring and evaluation. Of course, collaboration is key, and this includes stakeholders across all sectors to make sure that we're identifying and filling in any gaps when it comes to older adult related needs. And then lastly, this process of building and maintaining partnerships is not a one and done, it's a continual process. And so making sure that you're monitoring and evaluating those communication strategies with partner orgs and continuing to improve upon them and build upon them based on whatever needs get identified. And so I know I'm going through this pretty quickly, but we will have these slides in PDF format. We will have the video collateral. And so you'll have all this to refer back to. But we're now going to shift gears here and get into our breakout discussion.
Thanks, Tessa. Next slide. Great. So for the sake of time, we're going to take about 15 minutes for the breakout groups today. And so we're going to divide you all in very shortly. And, if folks can share their names, their affiliation again, what you hope to gain through the series and just in the space generally of what you're trying to do with your org, that would be great. And then your group monitor will direct each group to select someone in the group to serve as a speaker who will just report back some of the top points that you guys discussed in an end of session report out. And then we'll work through the discussion questions in each group. And so if we go ahead and go to the next slide here. And so for this, you'll see the questions that we're going to cover, and each room monitor is going to put these again in the chat within your group, and we'll share them out. But really briefly here, the questions that we're going to discuss are: how does your organization currently interact with older adults? What are your top concerns about disaster communication for older adult populations in Tennessee or your region? What are any needs or gaps that you've identified in older adult disaster preparedness? And based on the best practices shared, what are your initial thoughts on activities that you'd like to collaborate with other organizations on? Okay, thanks everyone for coming back. And so we're going to do a really quick round here of folks from each group sharing out any of the top things that surfaced in their conversations. And so I think we have 3 groups. Is that correct, Tessa? Okay.
Yes.
So I'm going to go ahead and say, Tessa, let's start with your group and whoever is reporting out.
Paul, if you wanted to go ahead and share a couple things if you're comfortable.
Myself off of mute. So we talked about, I think, how does your organization currently interact? We talked about how we have both a disaster team that addresses older adults who have been victims of disaster, but we have an enduring older adults program. One of the things that came out was the fact that as technology grows, we're moving more and more to online stuff and kind of like leaving some of the seniors behind as far as, ability to access those online stuff. Is very convenient. If you have a laptop or an iPad or something, you can do it, and a lot of seniors don't. Based on the best practices shared, I guess I'm focusing more on the seniors and the communication part, and the lack of technology that they may have an ability to file online. When we just say go online and file it, but we don't, that could be a big obstacle for seniors. That's what stood out most during the roundtable.
Thanks, Paul. Leanne, whoever'd like to report out from your group.
From our group, it was Shad, and we had such a good conversation with our group. So please go ahead.
Yeah, so for us, we talked about kind of going where people are at. So where the older population's at. I know in our agency with the Tennessee Department of Health, we just established a Office of Healthy Aging, and of course we interact with our agency on aging here in Tennessee and in our region. interacting with those older adults who may attend various support groups and things like that in the community. Top concerns for disaster cons, back to what Paul said, we discussed many of the same things. We just experienced a flooding, a disaster here in Northeast Tennessee, and there was many gaps that I saw that revolved around communication on where we really needed to go out to those areas to where folks were living in substandard conditions and not leaving their homes. And so those are some of the gaps that we need just to go with where the people are at on the front end. So like senior centers and different things like that. And then based on best practices shared, what are your initial thoughts and activities? Tennessee's made it, we've always been interacted as an agency, interacted with older adults in the aging community, but with the development of our Office of Healthy Aging, it's our commissioners made a priority for us, and it should be a priority.
Thanks, Chad. Both of you guys had great points that you made. And then lastly, Tiffany is going to share out from my group.
Hi. It sounds like our conversations had some similar themes. The thing that stood out the most to me was also the different communication needs for older adults, and some of it may be location based as well. So internet connections, relying on communication through internet may not be feasible for some older adults. Some older adults don't have smartphones, or maybe even cell phones. So having only text-based or only email or internet may not be good enough. So keeping in mind to use a really broad means of communication that, like Chad said, meet people where they're at, go take the information to the people instead of expecting them to conform to the way that most people do things now. Anything to add, McKenna?
No, that's sums it all up. That was good.
Well, thank you all so much for sharing. And again, we'll have a breakout session again next time and the second part of the series. And so look forward to everyone continuing their conversations. With that, now I'm going to turn it back to Tessa as we wrap up.
All right, thanks, Helen. And apologies, folks, we're getting pretty close to time here. We'll pause for any questions. We have a couple wrap-up resources that we want to share out, and so I'll send those. We can send those over email. But if anyone has any questions, you're welcome to unmute, put it in the chat, and then we'll also be sharing our email address. So if you have any questions later on that you think of, you're more than welcome to reach out. So I'll pause for just a moment here. I think we'll go ahead and move on, but just want to thank everyone for participating in the breakout sessions. Really, it's better when it's engaging, and we really are happy to hear from you all. So thank you again. And as we wrap up here, we just wanted to share out a couple of resources. So I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that we have a couple different audience sets that we target in the Prepare program, and at SVP as a whole. So we have a lot of great resources for homeowners, for renters, for practitioner audiences. And so we welcome you to check that out on our website, which is linked here, and we can put that in the chat. Next slide, please. And then we have, again, AARP's Disaster Resilience Toolkit. Again, a fantastic resource for you guys to have with a bunch of great case studies and examples of different things to consider building in your community. So definitely want folks to check that out if you have a chance to do so. Next slide, please. Thanks. And then lastly, as we wrap up on the resource section, wanted to share out some Tennessee specific information. So first, the Tennessee's Emergency Management Agency has a plethora of information on disaster preparedness, really across the whole disaster spectrum. So definitely a good starting point to look into for more information. Tennessee's Department of Health and Communicable and Environmental Diseases and Emergency Preparedness Division has a bunch of information as well. And then lastly, the Tennessee Public Health Training Center, Disaster Preparedness and Response, has a free training course that goes into a lot of great information on disaster preparedness and response and recovery, et cetera. And so that's a really great one to check out as well. So we'll share all this after the fact, but just wanted to highlight for you guys that there's a bunch of great Tennessee specific resources when it comes to preparedness. Next slide, please. And as we wrap up here, just wanted to share out. So session 2 is going to be on December 3rd. So same time as this one. And we're really going to get into tailoring messaging. So we're talking about implementing communication strategies for older adults in disasters. And so the format will be the same as today. We'll have a content piece on the front end. We'll have a discussion at the second half. And I just want to welcome folks to join us. And we hope to see you guys there. And then wrapping up, sharing quickly our objectives for session 2, all about tailoring communication strategies for older adults. We're going to talk about best practices for communicating that messaging that we're going to talk about tailoring. And then also we'll wrap up with creating guidance on how to create disaster plans specifically for older adults. So that'll be what we plan to cover on December 3rd. And then the last thing I'll share here is that AARP was kind enough to offer as an incentive for folks to take this 1-minute survey, some disaster supplies backpacks. So we do have some of those to raffle out to folks, and we're really thankful for AARP for offering that. And so if you guys wouldn't mind just taking a moment to fill this out, it should just take a minute, and everyone that does complete the survey today and then on December 3rd is going to get entered into a raffle to win a backpack. So we hope that's an exciting incentive, and more on that once we pick our winner in a few weeks' time. Alrighty, and that concludes our session today. Thank you all again. We really appreciate your time. I know it's a really busy time of year, but really appreciate you guys spending your morning with us today and having conversations and letting us learn from you in our breakout sessions. It helps, a lot of learning back and forth is really important for everyone in this space. So thank you again for your time. We'll go ahead and wrap up, and please reach out if you have any questions, comments, anything along those lines after today's session. Thanks again, all. Bye.